Also, if we talk about the probability of movement being successful, we know that of course the backfire plays an important role, but what is even more important, I think, is the participation and the diversity and how broad is that participation. So my question is to Victoria, whether you see protesters trying to reach out to other groups, like business groups in Hong Kong, civil servants, ordinary Hong Kong people, ethnic minorities, and if so, how do they exactly try to broaden the movement, try to diversify the movement in order to have a greater leverage than in negotiations or in disruption?
Yeah, so now we see all these young faces, all these students who are really at the forefront of this umbrella movement. But again, we have to really think back that, you know, this movement is 30 years in the making. And then, so again, theory of contentious politics talk about processes and episodes. So Hong Kong's democracy movement, it, you know, has experienced long processes, ups and downs. And then over time, there have been these different episodes, the 1980s, and then 2003 with the anti-Article 23 campaign. And then in 2012, there was the anti-patriotic education campaign. And then, so the current wave actually is connected to Occupy Central. It started in 2013, and also the anti-patriotic education campaign. So this is why this time we have this coming together of Occupy Central leadership. Again, 2 professors and 1 pastor, and students' bodies, some form of high school students, and the Hong Kong Federation of Students, form of college students. So they have been the people who are organizing all these activities and protests and this disruptive action this time. It is important to keep in mind that's because the movement has been going on for so long. So each wave, each episode was a response to a different crisis. And every time there was a better group of people, a better group of leaders who could actually provide better answers to the crisis, better solution to the crisis, or provide better leadership. What's striking is that those pre-existing leaders, they didn't just fade away, but they would stand behind the new leaders. They would graciously step aside and stand behind the new leaders. So this time the face of the leadership, again, the faces we see are Occupy Central and scholarism and Federation of Students. But what people often say, some maybe radicals, they would kind of dismiss what they call pan-democrats. The pan-democrats, they originally emerged from the 1980s. At the time, they were students. Now they are kind of, you know, middle age. But there's this unity, this fluidity of leadership over time, and this is why it's, at this point, we're really talking about an intergenerational and a cross-class movement. So really it's not about reaching out to different sectors at this moment in time, but the movement has grown by incorporating different sectors and different leaders. And also it is interesting to see that workers are also getting involved, because workers have been actually very, very strong participants in the entire democracy movement over time, and they're also democratic leaders who have worked to really promote workers' rights. And then business elites. There's another slide that has a picture of, for example, Jimmy Lai, who is one of the very rich people in Hong Kong, and he runs the Apple Daily. The Apple Daily has been streaming live the entire protest, and he also supports a lot of Democrats. And then there's also the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party is form of, again, very rich businessmen and professionals. And actually in 2003, they were the people who told the then chief executive, we cannot support the national security bill, and therefore the then CE had to shelve it. So it was because of the defection. So over time, this really has been this growing movement. Now, some people will also say that, but we see all these counter-protests and these protesters complaining about, counter-protesters complaining about the protesters. I think to some extent there may be some limits to how much you can still further grow the movement, how, you know, how many other sectors that you can actually integrate. In a way that Hong Kong has always had this 60 to 40 divide, in the sense that 60% of the population generally pro-democracy, 40% of the generation generally pro-establishment. And so when we see counter-protesters cursing and screaming at protesters, that's, you know, some of them come from the 40%, and then they tend to be actually less spontaneous, and therefore we also see maybe, you know, the thugs are getting organized in order so we don't really know why you know the counter protesters they just don't really come out.
You know, I can add to it. I think it's important to note the religious bodies as well. The Catholic Church has been very active, and the Catholic Church leaders have been active, and I think that's something that this protest shares with other communities that perhaps people can relate to. And also a really new phenomenon has been that ethnic minority students have shown up at the protest. Generally, our ethnic minorities, which are mostly South Asian, have felt sort of excluded from mainstream society. So it's quite interesting to see other day reports of now young ethnic minorities saying, you know, they're third generation in Hong Kong and they feel like they belong. Now, so there's some sort of positive things going on here in terms of inclusion in the society in this new demonstration that I don't think was as strong in the previous ones.
Yeah, something about religious groups is that the Catholic Church, because of Archbishop San, who has always been behind the democracy movement in Hong Kong, but Protestant churches are deeply divided. You have some at the forefront. So what the church led by, you know, the pastor who is one of the leaders of the Occupy Central, they are pro-democracy. But at the same time, they're also Protestant churches because they do not like gay rights, and therefore they are anti-democratic. At the same time, though, speaking of that, so LGBT groups have also joined forces, especially artists. They have joined forces with the pro-democracy movement.
What about the outreach to mainland Chinese? We know that they were that oftentimes mainland Chinese criticize Hong Kong residents, that they look down on them a bit. Hong Kong residents, they called sometimes Chinese mainlanders who are coming to Hong Kong as Lotus, who is invading the Hong Kong region. So how was the outreach, how effective is actually the movement in trying to reach out to different groups that might be potential allies for them in mainland China?
No, there is actually a growing divide between Hong Kong people and mainland Chinese, and partly it is because of nationalism and partly because of the language. So the language, Hong Kong people speak Cantonese. Now, you can call it a different dialect or a different language, but a lot of mainlanders don't even know what Hong Kong people are saying. So when you have these, you know, students leaders who are so articulate in just saying what they want, what this movement is for, mainlanders don't understand the word that they say. So this is one problem. And then another thing is also that for mainlanders, the return of Hong Kong to China in 1997 marks the end of what they call a century of humiliation. But for Hong Kong people, okay, 1997 marked a new era of uncertainties. And there are actually a lot of these differences. Now at the same time though, it's probably wise that Hong Kong protesters are not really reaching out to mainland Chinese or trying to break the Great Firewall. Beijing has been so nervous, so suddenly, since internet censorship spiked, and they're very worried that there will be the Hong Kong movement will be spilled into China. But that's not happening. But also because of what I said before, language and nationalism. So you would think that overseas Chinese students studying abroad, they will have no problem with censorship. They have access to whatever Hong Kong people are struggling for, but they are still pretty much against Hong Kong people. So for example, at Michigan State, there was this democracy rock. One person put up this sign, support Hong Kong and China democracy, and then another student from China got so upset and then covered that up with a PRC flag.
So, but do you think that actually reaching out to mainlanders in China would benefit the movement, or actually on the contrary, it may somehow overstretch the movement? What it should be really focused on organizing in Hong Kong? To what extent, even does the strategy of reaching out to mainland Chinese, it's beneficial for the movement?
Well, in other struggles, for example, Palestinians have to reach out to liberal Israelis. In the case of Hong Kong, though, to what extent that is, you know, feasible, or even as a wise move that is really debatable. It's, as we just mentioned, it is probably not feasible, and maybe it is not also not wise because so many people basically are really worried that Hong Kong, I mean, especially leaders in Beijing are very worried that Hong Kong cannot contain. So if Hong Kong people don't really make any conscious effort at spilling the movement over to the other side of the border, Hong Kong people feel that it's difficult enough to really fight for autonomy for Hong Kong. So, you know, mainland dissidents, they are inspired, but just, you know, this is out of our control. We don't really want to spread it, so don't be afraid. You know, we really only want autonomy in Hong Kong. So that's the message that they are sending.
Right. Yeah, the message is to guard Hong Kong's distinct identity and not to even encourage a view that it's part of the mainland in the sense that politics of Hong Kong will cross the border. There are mainlanders who have supported. In fact, there are reports that a number of them have been arrested for going online and expressing support for the Hong Kong democracy movement. Beijing has put a tight lid on it, but I think for the most part, Hong Kong leaders, protest leaders and others view it as in Hong Kong's interest to just keep Hong Kong as an autonomous area, a separate system, and not encourage Beijing officials to view it as part of a sort of broader mainland political movement. That would be disadvantageous.
Now, are there any opinion polls showing how many Hong Kong people support or oppose the movement those days? And what do those figures tell us about what movement must do to must do differently or better in order to increase the support of the local residents for the movement and for the struggle in general? And
well,
that's a question, right? That Mike, that's a question
yeah.
for you.
Who you want? Both of us could give the same answer. That there seems to be an absence of opinion polls on this. It's, you know, this here is just merely what I mentioned earlier, the gap between people, you know, supporting different kinds of things. But there's been, since the Occupy actually occurred, I don't, maybe Victoria knows, but I don't know of any, the people that do this are at my university. Robert Chong typically does this and asks people for their views, but we haven't been getting that data. It's kind of surprising.
Yeah, there have been no representative surveys. There have been just informal surveys of people already at Occupy sites. So obviously, you know, those people are there. They support the disruptive action. But in general, I think we can more or less go back to the long-standing divide of, you know, about 60% of the population being pro-democracy and about 40% being pro-establishment. And actually, in a way that the support, the ratio of support for democracy has been eroding over time because there have been more and more mainlanders who became Hong Kong citizens. And those people also have tended to be pro-establishment. So this explains why, you know, there are counter-protests and there are also people who have reservations about the umbrella movement.
Yeah, on this slide here, the thing that's kind of interesting is the bottom right corner showing a kind of high level of cynicism about whether the Occupy movement will produce results. That there's even protesters on the street feel that Beijing is kind of immovable. I kind of have taken the view in some writings that kind of the Hong Kong government is sort of doing a classic sort of proverbial rock and a hard place, Beijing on one side and protesters on the other. And there seems to be certainly a lot of challenge to the government to try to you know, mediate these differences.
It's actually the skepticism about reaching the the goal might be a positive sign in a sense that there is a commitment to a long-term struggle, to a protracted struggle, that this current campaign may not yield the results. We are skeptical, but at the same time we are out there because we think that our current protests, our demonstrations today might bring about change later on, maybe not immediately, but later. So to a certain extent, the skepticism in terms of reaching certain results right away might be actually a positive sign in a sense of the movement thinking about protracted struggle, because after all, despite the skepticism about reaching the goal, people are out there, are protesting.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Actually, there's one slogan that really stands out this time is 抗命不認命. What this means is that resist, do not yield, do not submit. So all the students' leaders, when they were told, you know, organizing any boycotts or organizing Occupy Central would be futile because the central government already made up its mind, you're not going to be able to change anything, so forget it, just face the realities. But what these young people are saying is that, well, even if we can't change anything this time, we want to have our voices heard. We want the central government, we want the Hong Kong government to know how much we do not like this particular decision and how badly we want genuine universal franchise in Hong Kong. They want to send this message, and I think this message is really heard now. And so in the future, if there's something else that the government wants to impose another very unpopular decision, they will have to take the population's reactions into account.